week had already felt like someone had taken the world's news, stuffed it into a blender, forgotten to put the lid on, and then switched the machine to Lickfee. Every direction I looked, another headline was demanding attention. Massive demonstrations were unfolding in Iran after the death of a young woman who had been arrested by the country's morality police. The images coming from the streets carried a mixture of grief, anger, and astonishing courage. It was impossible to ignore. At almost the exact same time, the internet collectively discovered that celebrity text messages can somehow be both deeply embarrassing and spectacularly boring. There is a special kind of disappointment that comes from realizing someone with every possible advantage in life apparently sends messages with all the romantic finesse of a malfunctioning chatbot. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden announced that the pandemic was over. Now, that's a bold statement. It's the sort of sentence that sounds wonderfully reassuring until reality taps you politely on the shoulder and whispers, actually, that's not how any of this works. You can't simply declare reality into submission. If I announce gravity has taken the afternoon off, I'm still not jumping off my roof. If someone declares Monday has been cancelled, millions of alarm clocks will continue their relentless campaign against happiness. Reality has always been stubborn like that. But as tempting as it was to linger on all those stories, there was another one demanding attention, because sometimes politics stops pretending to be government and becomes performance art with a taxpayer-funded budget. That story centred on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, or, as I increasingly thought of him, the politician who always looked as though he had somehow managed to wear a suit underneath his actual suit. Every appearance gave off the same strange energy, like he'd prepared for an emergency board meeting that might occur inside another emergency board meeting. Recently, DeSantis had arranged something that immediately dominated headlines. Roughly 50 migrants had been flown to Martha's Vineyard. The images surprised people across the country, not because airplanes landed there. Airplanes land there all the time. The surprise came from why these passengers had arrived and who had sent them. The migrants, including children, had been transported there as part of what DeSantis described as an effort to focus attention on immigration just weeks before the midterm elections. On paper, it sounded like a political statement. In practice, it looked considerably more like a publicity stunt involving actual human beings. And that's where the discomfort began, because whatever anyone's position on immigration policy might be, there is a profound difference between debating laws and treating vulnerable people like props. Martha's Vineyard isn't designed to receive newly arrived asylum seekers in large numbers. It isn't equipped with the specialised services, legal support, housing arrangements, translators or long-term infrastructure that people fleeing desperate situations often require. If your plan depends on dropping exhausted families into a location without preparing the place or the people, you are not solving a problem, you're creating one. It was an extraordinary example of political theatre. Unfortunately, theatre usually uses actors who volunteered for the role. These migrants hadn't. As details emerged, the story became even more troubling. Reports indicated that many of the migrants had been promised employment opportunities, housing assistance, and support that ultimately didn't exist. Some had reportedly received brochures describing government benefits for which they were not actually eligible. Imagine already navigating one of the most uncertain chapters of your life. You've crossed borders, you've escaped danger, you've placed your future in the hands of strangers. Then someone hands you official-looking paperwork suggesting stability is finally within reach. Only later do you discover the promises weren't real. Hope is difficult enough to maintain without someone manufacturing counterfeit versions of it. Then came one of those astonishing little details that somehow made the entire operation feel even more absurd. The brochures included a flag representing Massachusetts, except it wasn't Massachusetts' flag, not even close. Instead, whoever assembled the material had apparently found an unofficial redesign online, a version created by a private citizen who simply thought the state's existing flag could use an upgrade. That homemade design somehow ended up inside official-looking materials connected to a nationally reported political operation. You almost had to admire the accidental comedy. Imagine staging an elaborate political spectacle involving multiple states, airplanes, legal questions, national media coverage, and dozens of people, and then failing the equivalent of copying the wrong picture from Wikipedia. The creator of the unofficial flag reportedly expressed complete bewilderment after discovering his artwork had unexpectedly become part of a national controversy. He couldn't understand how anyone responsible for producing official documents had managed to choose the wrong emblem. Honestly, neither could anyone else. Because if your operation is sophisticated enough to coordinate interstate transportation, you would assume someone, somewhere, might spend approximately 12 seconds verifying what Massachusetts actually looks like. Especially if you happen to spend years attending Harvard Law School, which, unless geography has undergone some dramatic revisions while nobody was paying attention, is located in Massachusetts. That detail made the mistake almost poetic. You attended school there, you lived there, you graduated there, and yet somehow the state flag remained a mystery. It's like spending 4 years studying in Paris and later confusing the Eiffel Tower with a very ambitious radio antenna. As journalists continued investigating, legal questions began multiplying. A sheriff in Texas opened a criminal investigation concerning the transportation of the migrants. Now that raised another interesting question. Why Texas? Why not Florida? Well, because another curious fact emerged. The migrants hadn't actually originated in Florida. Think about that for a second. A governor portraying immigration as an urgent crisis affecting his own state ended up obtaining migrants from somewhere else entirely. That seems awkward. It's rather like insisting your neighbourhood is suffering an overwhelming squirrel invasion before quietly borrowing squirrels from another county because your own yard isn't producing enough evidence. When asked why migrants weren't being transported directly from Florida, DeSantis explained that they weren't arriving there in particularly large numbers. Instead, he described the situation as involving only small groups, tiny numbers. A handful here, a couple there. Essentially, the crisis he'd spent so much political energy discussing apparently required importing participants from another state to illustrate its urgency. That revelation landed with remarkable irony. The language used to describe the migrants didn't help either. At one point, they were characterized almost dismissively, reduced to phrases suggesting tiny, insignificant quantities. But these weren't statistics. They weren't cargo. They weren't campaign accessories. Each individual represented an entire life, an entire family history, dreams, fear, decisions that no one makes casually. People don't flee uncertainty because it's convenient. They do it because staying where they are has become even worse. And that's the uncomfortable truth, sitting underneath all the political slogans. Immigration debates are complicated. Weather policy is complicated. National security is complicated. Human dignity really shouldn't be. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Here was a politician who frequently criticised illegal immigration and human trafficking while simultaneously participating in an operation involving transporting vulnerable people across state lines using misleading information. Even if one accepted every political argument surrounding immigration, there remained an unavoidable moral question. When exactly did deceiving desperate people become acceptable campaign strategy? The whole episode felt less like governance and more like someone trying desperately to manufacture a viral social media clip. Unfortunately, the supporting cast consisted of real families instead of paid extras. And just as that story threatened to consume all available attention, another crisis reminded everyone that politics has an unfortunate habit overlapping with genuine human suffering. Far to the southeast, Puerto Rico was facing Hurricane Fiona. Unlike campaign events, hurricanes don't care about polling numbers. They don't wait for convenient timing. They don't postpone destruction because another news story happens to be trending. Fiona swept across the island, bringing heavy rain and powerful winds that knocked out electricity for nearly everyone living there. Emails arriving afterward were heartbreaking. Entire communities disappeared into darkness. Roads flooded. Discroft failed. One newly constructed bridge, built only a few years after Hurricane Maria, was carried away by floodwaters with astonishing speed. Watching it vanish felt surreal. The structure simply disappeared into the rushing water. When people describe something being swept away like a twig, they're usually exaggerating for dramatic effect. This time they weren't. A bridge became the twig, and that image said something far larger than the bridge itself ever could. Because Fiona, while certainly dangerous, wasn't even as powerful as Hurricane Maria had been years earlier. Maria struck Puerto Rico as a Category 4 hurricane. Fiona arrived as a Category 1, yet the damage remained devastating. That comparison revealed something deeply unsettling. Nature alone wasn't responsible. Years of incomplete recovery had left the island vulnerable. The scars from Maria had never fully healed. Infrastructure that should have been stronger remained fragile. Money had been allocated, promises had been made, plans had been announced. Yet too much of the necessary work either hadn't happened or hadn't happened quickly enough. Disasters expose weaknesses. Sometimes those weaknesses are natural, sometimes they're political. Puerto Rico had spent years waiting for meaningful improvements to its electrical system. Instead, residents continued living with instability. The power grid had already endured years of problems before a private company, Luma Energy, assumed responsibility for operating it. The expectation naturally was improvement. That was the sales pitch. Efficiency, reliability, modernisation. What people experienced instead was frustration. Power outages remained frequent. Some lasted astonishing lengths of time. Hospitals lost electricity. Homes endured repeated blackouts. Businesses struggled. Every interruption represented another reminder that something fundamental still wasn't working. During one congressional hearing, Luma's leadership faced obvious questions about performance. Asked to rate the company's progress on a scale from 1 to 10, became a letter grade, which is impressive in entirely the wrong direction. When someone asks for a number between 1 and 10, introducing the alphabet suggests either remarkable confidence or profound confusion. Eventually, the rating translated into something roughly equivalent to a 7, except even that arithmetic became questionable. Because depending on how you're measuring performance, 70% isn't exactly cause for celebration, especially when people are losing electricity during ordinary weather. The exchange grew increasingly uncomfortable as questions continued about outage numbers. How many had occurred? The response acknowledged there were outages every day, every single day, yet an exact figure wasn't readily available. Now, if you're running an electric utility, not knowing how often customers lose power feels slightly problematic. It's a bit like a pilot shrugging when asked how frequently airplanes land safely. You'd really hope that's information someone has written down somewhere. The frustration among Puerto Ricans had been building long before Fiona ever appeared on weather maps. And now the storm threatened to magnify every existing weakness. Systems aren't merely about convenience. They're hospitals, refrigeration, commuting water treatment, emergency response. Modern life quietly depends upon electricity until precisely the moment it disappears. Then suddenly, every ordinary activity becomes unexpectedly complicated. And for millions of people, darkness isn't simply darkness. It's uncertainty, it's anxiety. It's wondering how much longer essential systems can continue functioning. The hurricane had arrived, but the deeper story had been years in the making. As Puerto Rico struggled through yet another widespread blackout, there was something almost painfully symbolic about one particular moment. The governor stood before cameras to explain how the island was preparing for the approaching storm. This was exactly the kind of press conference people watch because they need reassurance. They want to hear that officials have plans, resources are ready, emergency crews are prepared, and someone competent is in charge. Then the lights went out, not metaphorically, literally. Right in the middle of the briefing, the electricity disappeared. Nobody screamed. Nobody looked especially shocked. In fact, what struck me most was how quickly everyone seemed to accept it, almost as though this had become just another item on the day's schedule. Storm briefing at 3, power outage at 3:07. Continue briefing whenever possible. When an entire room reacts to losing electricity with the emotional intensity of someone hearing that the copier is jammed again, you've reached a troubling level of normalization. That's what repeated infrastructure failures do. They slowly convince people that dysfunction is simply how life works. And that's dangerous, because people deserve better than adjusting their expectations downward every year until they begin celebrating merely average performance. The anger across Puerto Rico had been building for months. Residents organised demonstrations. People carried protest signs. Some of those signs weren't made from poster board. They were made from ruined household appliances. Think about that image for a moment. A broken microwave, a destroyed television, a refrigerator damaged by repeated power surges, objects that had become casualties in a battle nobody asked to fight. Those weren't just props. They were evidence that every outage carried financial cost alongside emotional. Then came one of the loudest public reactions imaginable. Bad Bunny stepped onto a concert stage. Now, if you're unfamiliar with just how enormous Bad Bunny is in Puerto Rico, imagine combining the cultural influence of a superstar musician with someone who genuinely understands the frustrations of ordinary people. At one point during the performance, he simply mentioned Luma Energy. That was it. Just the company's name, the audience erupted. Not because free merchandise had been announced, not because surprise fireworks appeared, not because someone promised every person in attendance a new car. They cheered because someone had publicly acknowledged the source of their frustration. Sometimes one word says everything. The response wasn't really about a company. It was about accumulated exhaustion. Everyone in that arena already knew the story. They had lived it. And the applause wasn't applause, it was recognition. As it turned out, Bad Bunny wasn't stopping with concerts. Just days earlier, he had released a music video for his song El Apagón, which translates to the blackout. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as expected. Music, visuals, energy, the sort of production fans anticipated. Then, roughly a minute into the video, something unexpected happened. The music essentially stepped aside. In its place arrived a documentary. Not a brief message, not a 30-second appeal. An actual investigative segment running approximately 20 minutes. Imagine clicking on what you believe is a music video and unexpectedly finding yourself watching an in-depth examination of public policy. It's the entertainment equivalent of ordering dessert and discovering someone has carefully hidden a graduate-level economics lecture underneath the whipped cream. Surprisingly, it worked. The documentary explored issues affecting Puerto Rico, featuring reporting from a local investigative journalist. There were graphics, financial information, political donations, discussions about public policy. One major topic involved Act 22, legislation designed to attract wealthy investors by offering significant tax advantages, including exemptions on capital gains. Supporters viewed it as economic development. Critics argued it benefited wealthy newcomers while long-time residents continued facing mounting hardships. Whatever someone's opinion of the law, the documentary forced viewers to consider questions extending well beyond temporary power outages. It asked who benefited from Puerto Rico's economic policies, who carried the burdens, who possessed influence, and who often found themselves ignored. What impressed me wasn't merely that the documentary existed. It was where it existed. Inside what many viewers believed would simply be entertainment. It was an unusually effective reminder that popular culture sometimes reaches audiences traditional news never does. People willingly clicked, then unexpectedly found themselves learning. That's a remarkably clever strategy, educational sneak attack. Honestly, I respect it. By this point, frustration throughout Puerto Rico had become unmistakable. Citizens weren't merely complaining. They were demanding accountability. One local resident put it bluntly, warning that if Luma failed to do its job, company officials should prepare themselves because Puerto Ricans might be patient. But patience has limits. There was no ambiguity in that message. People had endured enough. And after years of outages, broken promises, delayed repairs, and repeated reassurances that improvements were just around the corner, many simply stopped believing those assurances. Trust is difficult to earn, much easier to lose, almost impossible to rebuild after repeated disappointment. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Britain was participating in what can only be described as the Olympics of waiting in line. Queen Elizabeth II had died. Thousands upon thousands of mourners travelled to Westminster Hall to pay their respects while she lay in state. Now, every country has national stereotypes. Americans supposedly love oversized food. Canadians apologise to furniture after accidentally bumping into it. Australians appear remarkably comfortable sharing outdoor space with animals that look fully capable of winning cage matches. Britain, however, Britain loves queues, not casually, professionally. If patience became an Olympic event, Britain would immediately begin organising the line required to enter the stadium. The queue stretched for miles. People waited for hours, sometimes well over half a day. And yet, interview after interview revealed remarkably similar attitudes. Nobody seemed especially upset. Quite the opposite. Many appeared genuinely proud. One person described the line as bringing the country together. Another called it a great equaliser. Stotty disappeared. Occupation disappeared. Everyone simply became another person waiting their turn. There was something oddly comforting about that. Of course, as the line grew longer, entirely new logistical problems emerged. Eventually, officials needed a queue for the queue. That's right. People waiting to join the line first had to wait somewhere else until space became available inside the original line. It's difficult not to admire the commitment. Imagine loving orderly waiting so much that your solution to excessive waiting becomes additional organised waiting. At some point, the queue stopped functioning like transportation logistics and started behaving like mythology. Interviewers found people who admitted they never intended to participate. They had simply wandered nearby, seen the queue, and somehow become absorbed into it, like gravitational pull or quicksand or warehouse membership stores. You enter intending to buy one thing. Suddenly you're pushing an industrial-sized container of pretzels toward the checkout while wondering what happened. Apparently, British queues possess similar powers. The line itself became the attraction. And honestly, only Britain could transform standing still into a national achievement worthy of commentary. But eventually, attention shifted again, this time toward Brazil, one of the world's largest democracies. More than 156 million eligible voters, an election approaching rapidly, and growing concerns that the outcome might test the country's democratic institutions in unprecedented ways. Brazilian politics can occasionally produce campaign advertisements unlike anything else on earth. One candidate running for state deputy introduced himself as a samurai taxi driver. Those words alone already raised several fascinating questions. The commercial answered none of them. Instead, viewers witnessed energetic demonstrations involving nunchucks, enthusiastic posing, and editing choices suggesting nobody had watched the final video before uploading it. At one point, the candidate visibly reached toward the camera to stop recording. Somehow, that remained in the finished advertisement. Honestly, I admired the confidence. It's the political equivalent of submitting homework with first draft written across the top in permanent marker. Brazil's election included races for governors, senators, and numerous other offices. Yet everyone's attention focused on one contest, the presidency. Incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro sought another term. He was hardly an unfamiliar figure. Years earlier, he'd campaigned as a right-wing former military officer known for deeply controversial statements. His record included insulting remarks toward women, hostile comments regarding LGBTQ people, and an apparent fondness for making finger gun gestures in practically every available photograph. Some politicians have recognisable campaign logos, others have slogans. Bolsonaro often appeared to have chosen aggressive hand choreography. Now, as an incumbent rather than a challenger, he possessed advantages unavailable during his previous campaign. Official ceremonies increasingly blurred into political events. One especially striking example came during celebrations marking the 200th anniversary of Brazil's independence. Military aircraft filled the skies. Parachutists descended dramatically. Tanks rolled through the capital. Supporters gathered in enormous numbers. Then things became unexpectedly historical. Organisers transported the preserved heart of Emperor Dom Pedro I from Europe to Brazil for display during the celebrations. Yes, his heart. Just the heart, preserved for roughly 2 centuries, flown aboard a military aircraft. There are moments while reading history when you instinctively pause and think, surely I've misunderstood. This was one of them. Apparently not. Somewhere inside that carefully preserved organ rested enough historical significance to justify international transport. Although I couldn't help thinking, if your internal organs still attract this much travel 200 years after your death, you've had an unusually successful career. Bolsonaro's primary challenger was former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula remained an enormously significant political figure. He had previously served as president and left office with considerable popularity. However, subsequent corruption investigations known as Operation Car Wash resulted in criminal convictions that prevented him from running in Brazil's previous presidential election. Later, those convictions were annulled. That legal development returned him to the political stage. Polling consistently suggested Lula held a substantial lead over Bolsonaro, yet the election still generated extraordinary concern, not merely because of who might win, because of what might happen afterward. Bolsonaro repeatedly questioned Brazil's electoral system. He hinted that unfavourable outcomes might indicate fraud. He suggested suspicious activity before voting had even occurred. Those statements sounded familiar, perhaps uncomfortably familiar. History has a habit of repeating itself, sometimes as tragedy, sometimes as farce. Occasionally as social media posts followed by constitutional crises. As election day approached, observers increasingly worried that if Bolsonaro lost, he might refuse to accept the result. And unlike ordinary political disputes, this possibility carried unusually serious implications. But because democracies, public institutions, and communities all depend upon people refusing to treat accountability as optional, sometimes that means asking uncomfortable questions. Sometimes it means challenging convenient narratives. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let complex human stories be reduced to campaign props or fleeting headlines. Those aren't glamorous responsibilities. Neither is standing in line for 12 hours. Neither is repairing an electrical grid. Neither is conducting an election. Most of democracy's essential work isn't exciting. It's repetitive, patented, methodical, and occasionally frustrating, but it remains infinitely preferable to the alternatives. So as one remarkable week finally came to a close, I found myself hoping for something surprisingly modest, not perfection. No country has ever managed that. Just a little more honesty, a little more competence, a little less theatrical outrage masquerading as leadership, and perhaps, every once in a while, a week in which the world's biggest headline isn't someone discovering yet another creative way to make an already difficult situation even worse. That didn't seem like too much to ask. Then again, I've watched enough news to know better.